This is Sirens, a podcast brought to you by the Ladies of Bombshell, where we dissect the institutions of American power. Join us as we sound the alarm on technology, governance, and national security, and almost certainly lure some men to their deaths. I'm Lauren DeYoung-Shulman.
I'm Rada Iyengar-Plum.
And I wanted to, at the top of the episode, ask for a couple of things. One, if you haven't reviewed us before on your favorite podcast platform of choice, go ahead and do so. And I don't just mean like stars, though. Thank you. Thank you for the stars. Write some actual words. Give it a shot. See how it feels. Two, if you have people that you think would love this podcast, tell them and ask them to listen to it. And I say this because apparently it actually works, because a friend of ours recommended this podcast last week and suddenly we had like hundreds more people who are listening to us. So it actually
Hey, your friends.
It's incredible. And three, if you like actually subscribe to podcasts, which I'm bad at subscribing to podcasts. I just want to be real. But if you actually do it, hit the subscribe button. Just do it. It really does help. I don't really know what it helps with, but it makes us feel good. And that means we keep doing this podcast. So I wanted to ask about something that I've been very curious about for a long time. And that is, so we just had over the weekend, you couldn't have ignored this in the news, DC prom, nerd prom, whatever they called it, like the White House Correspondents' Dinner, which obviously, like, there's a lot of news that went along with that. We're not really going to discuss that. But it raised a question in my mind of, like, do other cities have weird nerd prom functions associated with their local lines of business? Because, like, I have been to tech prom, which I'm not even sure if it's real tech prom. It used to be run by Center for Democracy and Technology. As far as I can tell, it was mostly an excuse for people who'd worked the organization to stay up late and get drunk that night. And two, I've been to the Service to America Medals, which is an awesome, awesome event, which maybe has some of that same
government Oscars.
Yes, government Oscars. It's an amazing event. It is really genuinely lovely. We gave me an excuse to wear an actual tuxedo one year. But also, like, all these are, like, really awkward and kind of weird. Like, why do we do this? Like, do you have a prom?
I don't have a prom because I'm fundamentally antisocial. But I am married to the prom king of space prom.
Oh, of course you are. Yeah.
And I go to space prom every year, and I try to put on my best date of prom king. Just to be clear, I'm not the prom queen. I'm just the date of the prom king. But we go around and we schmooze and we talk the space. And the best thing by far is that Lockheed Martin has an after party in which they give you slippers and you can take off your heels and put on the slippers. And
incredible.
It is kind of incredible.
How?
But I have lived in other cities and I'm not familiar with any other proms a la the DC lifestyle. Now, I will say that, having said, New York has a range of galas and event, but the problem is they lack the high school prom feeling because they are, of course, completely fabulous. And should anyone wish to bring me along to any New York Fashion Week of any sort, I'm here for you. And all
but also to
Fashion Week needs.
Invest in my wardrobe at the same time and dress me.
Yes,
dress me, as they say.
And I feel like California is an anti-prom, so I don't know.
Yeah, like the after parties for all of these that I've been to have been like, the rooftop of the Watergate. And, like, to be honest with you, the first time I went, I was like, this is actually quite nice. And the view from the rooftop of the Watergate is actually amazing because it makes you realize that DC is a city of, like, significant hills and has beautiful views. But then you're sort of like, I'm on the rooftop of the Watergate and it's like a Tuesday. And I've kind of got to work tomorrow.
That's the other thing about proms in New York, in DC, is they're always on weeknights.
Yep.
Space prom is also always during Lent, and they get a special archdiocese dispensation to allow you to eat meat. So it's like a whole scene.
This is, I feel like this deserves, like, an explainer piece to be written about it. That's incredible. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, as I said, we are, like the White House Correspondents' Dinner was last week. I just don't have the wherewithal to, like, even try to get into this. So we're going to get into some other things that are
complexities ensued,
fraught in all of this. And so I sadly do not have an undersecretary for policy threatening the Pope this week. And I don't feel like that's really replicable. But for I do have, like, some, like, this is kind of like a little tawdry. My It's a Drill segment this week is something that I've been noticing some trends on for a while, but, like, it kind of came to a head in the last 2 weeks. and that Congress is basically engaged in its own very dark, very sad season of Veep. We have had in the last several weeks Eric Swalwell resigned amid some fairly intense and awful sounding sexual assault and misconduct allegations from multiple women.
I've determined the minimum set of women that must complain is 4. So
Mm-hmm.
it's a 4-to-1 ratio. If you have fewer than 4, no action is taken. Once there's 4, then you wait for the 4 to grow to a double-digit number, at which point significant action will ensue. I've spent some time looking at this. This is my assessment.
This is incredible, and Rada is a data nerd, so I trust her on this. The other thing I found fascinating, just as an aside, is I'm going to totally bungle this. There's this like California-based influencer who started posting stuff on the socials about allegations we heard about Eric Swalwell before, and this was basically her saying, I've gotten all these reports. I've been trying to get mainstream media to cover this. They're not. So I'm going to start just like alluding to things and just like giving like little hints of gossip. And it eventually resulted in any number of different media coverage, media organizations covering it. And I was just fascinated by this, how like, there's actually some really good discussion of like what it actually takes to get real coverage that your press and your publisher will go and support you on, rather than just like printing allegations. But it was the fact that she went out with the allegations that like it ended up getting this like big water.
But she had multiple women who underlie this. I spent some time thinking about this because I feel like there's a missing product market for basically the Tinder for like creepy dude / sexual assaulter. So on the spectrum, all the way from creepy harassers through sexual assaulters and everything in between, in which if you match and you swipe right on him, if 4 women swipe right, then it goes directly to a journalist. This is the app I wish to do.
There used to be like the various lists of men, which I always found kind of bizarre and creepy. This is better use of technology. Okay, so and beyond Eric Swalwell, we had also Tony Gonzalez, who resigned after admitted to an affair with a staffer who, I should note, died by suicide. Sheila Sherfilis McCormick resigned just like a couple of minutes before the ethics committee was supposed to have a sanctions hearing for her. Those are the ones who have actually taken action. We also have Corey Mills under investigation also for sexual misconduct. Nancy Mace, who was under investigation for improperly handing housing reimbursements. And then George Santos, maybe you remember him, hard to forget, this young man, posted a list of current and former members he claims to have engaged in sexual misconduct. So, well then. So in all these cases, to me, what's interesting is that like the ethics committee, we have an entire committee that is devoted to this topic, ethics. It got close to doing something for those members that resigned, but then they resigned first. And then they lose jurisdiction. They can't actually do anything or further investigate after that. And they have for a long time, lots of folks have complained about this, saying that like they need more investigators, they need a more streamlined process, they need people not to prolong the process for a long time, and they need the ability to continue investigations after a member resigns. Because unless like they've done like truly criminal conduct and it gets handed off elsewhere, you basically just lose this, even though they've been working in the public interest while they were doing whatever this bad stuff was. So this is a really sad, awful, tawdry, and we should probably fix it, accountability infrastructure that doesn't really have a good enforcement mechanism and just relied a lot on, this may sound familiar to you, norms. And we should maybe do something about that.
Norms.
Mm-hmm.
So I had 2 drills. The first is the latest DoD firings, because for folks who are following along, we're firing people all the time at DoD. So
it's mind blowing. I used to like be able to talk about this to my students as like it's a lesson to leaders of like when a leader is willing to fire somebody. And now it's like Tuesday.
So actually, it's interesting. I was at a conference where somebody said this, which is, so the most recent firing is in Navy Secretary Filan. So John Phelan was fired last week. We're recording here on Monday, April 27th. So this was a little less than a week ago, last Wednesday. He was fired. He was resigning effective immediately. There was a lot of discussions on whether it was the shipbuilding being too slow, or him going around Hexith and talking to Trump, or him refusing to ignore a federal judge on sanctioning Mark Kelly, like could be any of these things, right? There's a lot of, but I think the most interesting thing here is like take away the underlying reasons and rationale. If you were looking at a large organization that saw significant senior leader turnover, and here's what I would say: more than a dozen senior officers as fired, forced to resign, or pushed out. And let me just give us a little list because I compiled it in preparation for this. There is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, CQ Brown. There was the CNO, Lisa Franchetti. There was the Air Force Vice Chief, the number 2 in the Air Force in the military uniform, James Life. There was the Army Chief of Staff, Randy George, just a couple of weeks ago. There was the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, Jeff Cruz. There was the commander of Southcom, Alvin Holsley. There was the Navy John Harrison. There was Vice Admiral Chatfield, who was on the NATO Military Committee. There was, what's his name? Tim Hawk, who was the cybercom / national security advisor. And now we have Secretary Phelan. And I would say, even if you ignored the cause, if you saw a large organization with this many terminations and turnovers without clear explanation or cause, you would be concerned about the health and viability and stability of that organization, because that level of senior leader turn is just tough.
Oh, well, it has a lot in common. I'm going to make a joke now that you don't understand around it. It's okay. I barely understand it either. It has so much in common with the Boston Red Sox right now. Their front office just got rid of like their entire coaching lineup. And that all kinds of gossip is going to come out, which actually speaks to a question or a point that like I thought. So all that is interesting, and like this speaks to like a very unhealthy and sad and scary organization. The thing that is fascinating to me is that from all of that, you would expect from any other organization, oh, there's going to be tea. There's going to be gossip that comes out after. And there has been some. I think it's reasonable to assume that some of the things that we have heard, maybe off the record or on background, have come out as a result of these senior leaders leaving. But there certainly hasn't been a wave of like, oh my gosh, that is clearly from all the senior officials in the department who have been pushed out. I think there's a lot of reasons behind that, but that is, you would, in an organization like that, you would expect a wave of just like gossip and badness and awfulness to come out. And you're not seeing that in the same way. Not to say that it's not there. It is just an interesting thing to note.
Yeah. I mean, on the one hand, you worry about what the culture might be that inhibits that. And on the other hand, well, I don't know what the other hand is, but there's probably another one.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like part of this, and we talked about it before, is that I think in some of these cases, in the departure of these individuals, the way that they left, some of them were like basically fired, but were like allowed to resign in some way, which allows them to keep access to some of their retirement benefits in some case.
Exactly.
Which may be something to hold over their head, as well as the ability to downgrade some of their service or to threaten them in the way that the secretary, we talked about Mark Kelly earlier, to threaten them in that way too.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that it sounds fine. And
everything's fine. But also, Lauren, we're going to give the DoD $1.5 trillion.
It's a lot of money. And I just want to be real. I know it sounds like DoD can just like burn money just by like sneezing every day. I don't think it can spend that much money.
Yeah. So here's the thing. It's not the thing. Here are many things. One thing is, it's not $1 trillion forever. It's like first of all, it's $1.5 trillion, which is like the most hugest budget ever.
Yep, that's a lot of money.
It's split between normal appropriations and reconciliation, which doesn't really have a real bill. Third, it's a really big number with a really complicated path and probably not long-term sustainable. So it's hard to tell how much of it is like a real number and how much of it is a signal. But the thing that gets me is this. It's not totally clear what the money does. Again, I'm not a person who's like, oh, the defense budget should shrink. And I think like actually investing in DoD does a lot for the American economy and does a lot for actually a range of social programs and health and education, blah, blah, blah. But leaving all of that aside, like when you appropriate the money and then, for instance, the administration can just decide, hey, it's an election year and we would like a thing called a warrior dividend. We're just going to take the money to fix military housing and call that a warrior dividend and not fix housing. It's not clear that what you're buying with the trillions of dollars or trillion of dollars
Mm-hmm.
is actually the thing you think you're buying. So that's piece one, right? Like it's not clear what the money actually does unless you have some accountability and management. But the second piece is even if you have the money, you still have to spend the money and do the things. And like I was just at something the other day and I'm saying, look, it doesn't matter how many trillions or billions or trillions of dollars you give the Department of Defense. If you fire all the contracting officers, you can't actually spend the money, the large point. But
As
then
it turns out.
even if you can spend the money, and like Golden Dome is a good example of this, you can get contracts maybe out the door and say they're ahead of schedule. Then you say, hey, is this something the American people want? And the person in charge of this, in this case, General Gutlein, asks about it, and he's like, no, they're not really supportive. You're like, well, then
How?
what is it we're doing here? And like, you can do the same story on munitions where you're like, hey, munitions, we appropriated all this money. Are we getting more munitions? No. Production timeline. What about ships? We're putting so much more money into ships. Yeah. We don't have enough shipyards. AI, we put so much money into AI. Well, we banned and declared a supply chain risk our top AI. Right? Like it's just the bottom line is like you can scale your spending, but that's not actually a substitute for having a strategy. And I think like the top line is the top line, but anyway, there ended my rant.
You know what they should do with all this money while they have it is just like
Buy me shoes. No, okay, sorry.
well, no, that's fine. Like, they should send just like pick a random office every week and send them to the spa.
Oh my God, it would be
Can you
so good.
imagine?
I mean, I feel like they're what's the federal employment viewpoint? FEVs. The FEVs would really go up for DoD.
That's true. That's true. Okay, well, there's no Pope this week, but
There is potential spas.
there's yes, potential spas. So let's move into dumpster fires, where again I just get so much satisfaction with texting Rado. I'm like, hey, we're gonna talk about the National Science Board, and I just like I just like love picturing her mind being like, what is that? And it's so important, guys. Like, there's so many things that have been happening with like science advisory committees and councils and boards and commissions, and it's a big deal. And we're going to talk about why.
What I love about it too is like I have your Google News feed and like News for You, and then Lauren texts me, and so then I have to start Googling things and learning about whatever it is that I'm supposed to talk to her about, and it really changes the scope of what's appearing in my news feed. And so it seems like maybe like going beyond our slightly morose, the democracy is dying kind of conversation here, it's worth talking about what is going on with boards and committees inside the federal government. And so
100%.
for folks who are following along and who Googled this because their friend texted them about it, you will have seen a bunch of headlines recently about the National Science Board where there were 24 members who were all fired last week. And the same thing is true for this ACIP, the CDC's Vaccine Advisory Committee, which was gutted and restocked last year. The NIH grant panels have also been changed, the FDA advisory committees. So I think the honest reaction for most people is like, okay, well, that doesn't seem great. But like on the scale of things that are happening in the federal government, how bad is this? How much should I fret? Is this just like a Washington processes my Valentine drama, or is this a real drama? And so I thought based on our conversation, what might be helpful is to think a little bit about what are these bodies? What do they do? And then what are actually the real consequences for when they stop doing what they do and actually do other things? And, there are some different categories here. So let's maybe start at the foundation, which is, Lauren, why does the federal government rely on outside expert bodies in the first place? Like, what are we trying to solve? Why does the government have a bunch of these in place? What's the deal?
Okay, this is a great question because it is totally fair if you hear like federal government advisory boards and commissions or FACA, things like that, and you're like, wow, that sounds kind of useless. And in some cases, you are right. Some of these things are fairly, if not fake, then just sort of performative. However, there are some that are a big deal, and I want to explain why. Because the origin story for this, the one that kind of cued this story, goes back to World War II. And this is like one of my favorite names ever. Vannevar Bush. Like, what a name. Like, can you
Sure.
imagine just like being born with that? Okay. So he was basically, if you don't know who he is, go spend some time on Wikipedia. If you do know who he is, forgive me for butchering all of this. He did a whole lot of science shit, as one says, during World War II or around that time period. He coordinated a bunch of scientists on various war efforts, whether it be radar or the Manhattan Project or penicillin or any other cool things that we did at that time, which were really pretty great. And he was asked, as the war ended, what should we do with science now? Which, to be fair, like that's a big question. If somebody asked me that, I would panic. He wrote a report, as one does, called Science, the Endless Frontier. What a great name. Not Star Trek, which became the founding document of post-war science policy. And people still reference it today. And trust me, I would know. Its essential argument, it had a lot of things that it said, but one of the big ones was basically that basic research is like hella important. It is the seed corn of national power. And it has to be insulated from short-term political pressure and also the military, notably, because scientific progress operates on timescales that various administrations and elections can't really see across. Totally awesome. The tension that he was trying to work through hasn't really gone away because he wanted science to be governed by scientists, which if you've been in a meeting with scientists, you might question, is that a wise idea? However, what his view was like the foundation, we should have a foundation that is led by researchers, people who understand science, who would select a director that the president was pretty much kept at arm's length from. And the Congress was like that, who had been in meetings with scientists were like, no. They wanted presidential appointment authority, and they had a compromise, basically that presidents can appoint the head of the NSF, but in staggered terms, with independence requirements and conflict of interest, blah, blah, blah. And with the system designed knowing the presidents would try to influence it, but they set up a whole lot of systems and committees and boards around it that were meant to shape the professionalism and the scientific integrity of this work. And that includes this National Science Board we talk about, included some of the advisory committee structures that we talk about, which are technically advisory but have a whole lot of power, and then laid the groundwork for Congress to have a whole lot of have set up advisory committees that have some statutory authority where yes, they may be technically advisory, but like they're basically writing the first draft that you have to stick with. And all of that has been called into question a number of times in history, but has really been called into question over the last year where the Trump administration has, for example, fired the National Science Board or eliminated the members of the Vaccines Commission or Vaccines Committee, which presidents have kind of gotten pissed at their scientists before, reasonable, like Nixon has, but they haven't done anything on this scale. And to your question on like, why is it we have all of this? Like, you generally don't want politicians to be able to say like, I need scientific results tomorrow because that's just not how science works. But you do need politicians to be able to say, but you guys can't spend insane amounts of money just studying why are flowers pink. You need to do stuff that's in the national interest. So this was effectively the compromise.
So you went through kind of quickly there a couple of different categories of these boards, and I often, until my Google searches revealed differences, lump them together, and that's actually a mistake. So maybe let's take one quick like side beat to say, what are the differences between governing bodies like the National Science Board, the traditional, you call them FACAs, the Federal Advisory Committees like the Vaccine Panel, and then more hybrid things like these NIH, the National Health Institute of Health, grant councils, and kind of where are we in new territory legally, and where is this just kind of a more extreme version of business as usual?
Okay, so there's a big variety, and they come in different forms and flavors. So let's start with the FACA, the Federal Advisory Commissions Act, Councils Act. FACA is just like a great word. They are probably the most common, and there's lots of different iterations of them, but basically their role is to advise, give like very nice advice, and not to actually govern. And their meetings have lots of requirements about them. If you've been on a FACA, you know this. They have to be public. They have to have charters. Their members have to disclose conflicts of interest. The president or the secretary can appoint kind of whoever he wants to that. And some of them are like big deals, like this vaccine one we're talking about, and some of them are like, it's nice that you're here. I appreciate you coming to this meeting twice a year. Um, the NSB is different. It's kind of like a board of directors. Congress created them by statute. They gave them authority to beyond just like, hey, here's your advice. And they built in staggered terms in order to prevent political capture. They're not just an advisor for NSF. They have some statutory authority to set overall guidance and to approve major expenditures. I think it's a reasonable question of whether or not this is cursory or not, but whether the president can actually fire all of the members of this board is a genuinely unsettled legal question, and I expect there's going to be a lot of fun litigation about it. The hybrids are kind of funsies. So you have folks like the NIH advisory councils who review grants, and FDA advisory committees that have some specific roles around specific kind of drug review. So NIH reviews grant applications before they're funded. FDA committees evaluate drug approvals. They are technically advisory, but they are basically quasi-operational because they are the administration has generally they're quasi-operational because like their work. It's not that it's like absolutely mandated unless Congress said so, but they provide in many cases like a very definitive first draft, and going against them would be a big deal. The administration strategy here is not to like get rid of them all, but to just not convene or not replace people or have attrition. But with all of these, the litigation strategy is, or like the way that this works legally is interesting, because if you fire everybody, if you stop holding meetings, if you ignore them in whatever way, the law takes a lot longer than whatever action you just took there, because the court is just going to move slower than your ability to say like, oh, I'm not going to listen to scientists anymore. That's going to take like 6 months for the court to do anything about it.
So let me take these in a couple of pieces. Let me start maybe with the most extreme of the National Science Board firing, but I want to come back to this death by attrition point that you're making, which I think is really important. So on the National Science Board, this is a governing body, so it's not just an advisory committee. It has actual authority, and it was fired like in a single email. So what does it mean practically that it got fired? What was the board doing before it got fired? What is the deal here?
So as I said before, it's closer to a board of directors than it is to just like an advisory committee, though their actual power depends on how much they want to weigh in. They have, so you may recall over the last year or so, we've talked about this, there has been more politicization and also cuts in science funding, not only in NSF, but more broadly. One of the things that has happened is the NSB members and his body have criticized Trump administration's proposed cut to the NSF's budget. One board member said that the White House was already kind of bypassing the board because OMB had told the NSF, there's just a number of versions of this where OMB had told the NSF to do something without board involvement. Even the board had said, no, that's required. And like, there's like a lot of small pushback and also big pushback that's going on between OMB, which is weighed in heavily on what the NSF is doing versus the NSB and NSF overall. And Congress has been like, hey guys, actually we want you to spend a whole lot more money on science. And as we talked about in one of the prior episodes, the OMB has basically like slowly leaked out money to NSF in ways that are maybe not entirely legal, TBD. But the legal exposure here is interesting because it's the way that terms are set up in NSB suggests that members should have removal protections, meaning they can't be fired unless it's for a specific reason. And the administration is basically betting that the Supreme Court's recent trajectory on unitary executive theory will totally cover this firing and be like, actually, this is fine. The president can do this. Whereas folks who oppose this are saying, no, this is not okay. And you actually are going to have to be able to, you cannot remove us all at one time. And in the vacuum of this, we don't actually have a current head of the NSF. The administration has been trying to actively and tacitly cut science funding overall. And this was one of the, if not an actual check, though a quasi-check, it is definitely a parallel political force. And in the absence of an independent body is a big deal.
So, okay, that's not ideal and seems like maybe there are at least some potential judicial remedies for it. Let me talk to you about what sounds a little bit more concerning to me, which is things like the NHS and FDA stories that you mentioned before, where it is like vacancy accumulation, committees stop meeting, members age out and they're not replaced. In those cases where you've got this, like I said, death by attrition, walk us through what it means when these bodies can't function, and like how should we think about this kind of slow attrition in terms of the dismantling of the effectiveness of these types of committees?
Yeah. So basically, it means that the administration doesn't have to like put out a press release saying we're not cool with this. They can just do it very quietly and they actually, it's a much more effective strategy for them than outright firing for them, because it doesn't generate a ton of headlines. You just have to see what they're doing. There's not like a clean legal target, because while the bodies may be statutory, the requirements for what they do are more driven by like you have to have a meeting or things like that than anything else. You have to like approve stuff. You can't sue over like an appointment that wasn't made or a meeting that wasn't held usually. And it takes a while for you to realize how damaging it is, because you're not going to necessarily notice like, oh, this drug wasn't approved for like, unless you're like studying it. You're not going to notice that the way an NIH grant didn't get out the door unless you're studying it closely. Like there's going to be a lack of political attention to it. And that means that you don't have a lot of room for litigation, and there's just like not a lot for the public to push back on. So with all of this, it's just like a slowdown. It is both a slowdown of the actions of these bodies, but also an absence of platform for scientists who are meant to be the experts to be able to weigh in on the things that government had asked them to be able to do, which means they just like the ways that experts have been shaping science policy and science funding in this administration is just fundamentally different than how we've seen in prior administrations.
And maybe I'll tie us together and kind of last question in this section, which is, look, we're in a post-Trump election where the American people have kind of issued a verdict on these type of, I'll frame it slightly controversially, kind of elitist, anti-democratic processes, right? And this is at its core expert governance, where we're trying to take this out of the political process. And how do you think about the role of these types of institutions, the importance or lack thereof of them, in a world where you've got a public that, let's be honest, has lost trust in at least some of the significant portion of the public in health sciences and science more broadly, is looking for these more populist moments? How do we think about these types of expert governance offerings?
This is one of my huge frustrations, is that over the last several years, particularly post-COVID, but not uniquely so, scientists and the role of science in government has taken a huge hit in terms of trust by both Republicans and Democrats for a number of different reasons, and did a fairly poor job in most cases to try to both understand that problem and also try to win back that trust. Because we set these up many decades ago for a reason, in that the vaccine policies shouldn't be based on who wins elections, and that science funding shouldn't be based purely on who wants to win the next presidential election. That's the way we did that on purpose. But that's in tension with democratic accountability. And when Americans are saying we don't feel totally comfortable with how things have been going, it's reasonable of them to, one, elect a president who apparently wants a different science policy, even though he's an idiot. And also reasonable of them to say, we want to see changes in how things are being done. Is this the right change? I don't think so. But the expectation for change was not crazy. And particularly as you see, there's been a bunch of criticism around the revolving door and some of the financial ties between some of the committees that we're talking about and the decisions that they are making. And while those may be based in scientific study, the fact that they are receiving financial benefit from it, this is incredibly hard to ignore. But the way to fix that is not by saying we get rid of everybody and just put in a whole bunch of people who, for example, oppose vaccines, or to totally dismantle the NSF, the National Science Board. There's a lot of stuff that people talk about for decades in terms of better peer review, or having different kinds of ways that you think about science funding, or more transparent ways that you deal with both vaccine science, but also vaccine harms. But so none of this is going to help what we've been looking at for a long time, and that is public trust in science and the scientific institutions that have been at the basis of this, and the role of independent bodies in trying to help, I guess, immunize or protect anything from politics. Like, that is clearly no longer working. But we need to rethink that in terms of like, how can we both reintroduce science in terms of the role of science in government policy to American people, but also do so in a way that isn't so elitist or distancing as we have seen in the past.
Yeah, I mean, just to close this out, it's clear that both there is a desperate need to rebuild trust between the scientific community and the American public, and a desperate need to reconnect scientific influence into policymaking and decisions. And how we get both of those to be true in short order seems like a topic that we should cover again on Sirens.
We'll get there.
Okay, well, this week on Warning Signs, we are very excited to have a special guest. There's obviously been a lot of discussion on our podcast, but also in the world, on AI, autonomy, and drone warfare. And the conversation, it started, I think, a little bit during the Ukraine war, but now it's a defining feature of the Iran war. So to help us think it through, we're joined by Lauren Kahn. Lauren is a senior research analyst at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology, where she focuses on national security applications of AI. She came to CSET from the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, where she worked on emerging capabilities. So she's been kind of inside and outside and writing what I think is some of the best analysis out there on what drones in Iran actually tell us about the future of war. So Lauren, welcome to Sirens.
Thanks so much for having me, and thank you very much for the very generous introduction.
So maybe you can help us by just helping us frame this moment. It's kind of starting big. You've been making this case that we're in an era of precise mass, quotes around it, that is defined by these low-toss autonomous vehicles and weapon systems that are kind of, as a group, referred to as drones. But that word drone, for your readers who don't do defense, like my kids have drones. There's all around, right? Like,
and then because those are actually illegal in the District of Columbia, Rada.
Well, only if you go to the special areas where you can both fly drones and shoot off rockets on certain days.
Okay, that's fair.
Welcome to having a space.
Okay.
Family. Anyway, but maybe you can start by helping us think about like, what are drones? How does this relate to this idea of precise mass? Is there a taxonomy we should have in our head about these? Like, help us understand this ecosystem and put some meaning to some of these words.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I think this is an interesting one, and I'm really glad you used the word taxonomy as well, because drones, like any other capability, as you see that evolves over time, we've had it for decades and decades, right? With things starting, from the war on terror and predating that, where you have things like the low altitude, high endurance, and the medium altitude, high endurance capabilities like the Predator and Reaper systems, right? Which are basically just airplanes without people on them. And then you have everything to the point that you make, about the commercial kind of drones that you can get off the shelf today at like a Costco or off of Amazon. And they all generally are referred to as drones. Similar to like you have a common ancestor, now in the animal kingdom, I think that gives rise under sufficient environmental pressure. You have distinct speciesization, right? Where you have these different capabilities that look very different and have their own classifications, right? I would say you have, again, like those Predator and Reaper drones, you have one-way attack drones, you have even like future collaborative combat drones that all share this lineage and a label, but in terms of cost, range, and use, they share increasing little else today. And so precise mass, I would like to say, is not just drones, but it is all these kind of capabilities that you think that have this low cost attritability, right? Where when you lose one, it's a little less harmful and you can use them en masse to get precise effects. But yeah, drones is this kind of, we are in this part where this technology has evolved now, but we're still haven't kind of updated our way of thinking and description of drones such that it encompasses this whole range of capabilities that really do everything more like low cost cruise missiles where they're, fire and forget, that you don't mind that it blows up and that it doesn't come back, to other things where you use over and over again, much more like an aircraft.
Okay, so in that context, let's turn to the real world. We've talked about drones increasingly since the Ukraine war, but it seems like maybe Iran, this conflict in Iran in 2026 is the moment where the shift in that, like the nature of warfare, the character of war, is really becoming obvious and a topic of conversation. So maybe you can help us first by just what has actually been going on, and what's the operational picture, and what does that tell us about kind of what militaries like the Iranian military, I'll call it like a mid-tier military, what can they do now that really wasn't possible, 3 or 5 years ago?
Yeah, you see the Ukraine being the first real drone war, and you're seeing these used increasingly by the United States and other militaries in the field in Iran. And these capabilities, again, it's this democratization of access. Previously, when you had the precision strike revolution, these like more exquisite capabilities like the Predator, like the Reaper, that were really relatively more expensive and can do a lot of different things. You needed those to get high degree of precision, but that would take a lot of investment, bells and whistles, and crafting, again, very high tech defense industrial base that you would need to produce these systems. That was pretty robust. Now, with rapid developments and things and enabling technologies like artificial intelligence, computer vision, additive manufacturing, and even access to space-based systems and GPS that has increasingly been democratized with the commercialization of these technologies, you have much lower barriers to entry, both in terms of costs and accessibility. And so some of these systems can be really bought off the shelf, so to speak. So now you have this proliferation of capabilities with these high degree of precision, relatively speaking, for a very low cost, and again, very low barriers to entry. So you're seeing these middle tier kind of militaries use and experiment with these in a level that we really hadn't seen before. I mean, I think it's quite surprising, for example, that Iran, was the first one to develop the Shahed loitering munition one-way attack drone. It's been quite popular both in the conflict in Ukraine with Russia, and also now again in this conflict as well. And now you had even the United States looking to Iran and reverse engineering a capability that it saw, that it liked, that it didn't have, and created its own version, which is really the first time that something like that has happened since the Cold War. United States always looks at adversary capabilities and looks to pick them apart, but that's really to identify vulnerabilities and weaknesses, not to use it itself. And so you're seeing this difference in access that states have to these capabilities that really is quite unprecedented.
Yeah, well, let me pull the thread on that. Our reverse engineered, our Lucas, which is a reverse engineered Iranian drone. And I think we've seen the back and forth between Russia and Ukraine do these kinds of things. So maybe let's turn it for a moment just to how the Pentagon is actually approaching weapons and platforms and force structures. And should we just, stop buying submarines? Are we overinvested in these sort of big legacy systems? Where do you think we're sort of most underinvested or most exposed in this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think to your point, I mean, everyone always says, tanks are now obsolete, submarines are now obsolete. We've said this over and over and over again. It even happened after World War I when they first used the tanks. Like, now that the surprise effect of tanks is gone, we're never going to use them again, which is proven untrue. So you still need these core exquisite capabilities. They still offer real competitive advantage in certain cases and real valuable use case. And you see them evolve with the times, right? It's really interesting to just see the physical evolution, again, to this, not to make this tortured metaphor of species and the animal kingdom. But when you see now, if you look at the tanks that are happening in Russia, all these different nets and spikes that they're adding to them to be counter drone capabilities and resilient against drone, it's really fascinating how you see the physical manifestation of these capabilities change. So these capabilities won't go away. They'll evolve, and the use cases might evolve as they have increasingly complementary systems that might be low cost systems like drones, one-way attack, etc. And so you have to think about them in a high-low mix. You have to think creatively about what is the solution you're trying to achieve and what is the best mix of capabilities where you can use, very exquisite capabilities and very low-cost systems. You saw this with some of the earlier interventions back last summer with that Israel engaged in, and the United States and in Iran. And so again, it's this important mix where you see this combination of, traditional large fighter jets, fighter pilots, et cetera, along with these low-cost capabilities to really devastating effects. And so the United States shouldn't divest entirely from our submarines. We definitely need those and other capabilities. But at the same time, these capabilities are quite cheap, and more so they can be easily produced by a range of companies and private sector actors. They don't need to be made by the big primes of the world. And so I think there's gains to be had, and there's a lot of money on the table, so to speak, in terms of capability when you get to things like precise mass and things that my cohorts and I have written about extensively, where you have these systems again that give you quite a bit more bang for your buck. And so I think with a 1.5 trillion defense budget, we could probably afford to shore up some of our defense precise mass, capabilities. Again, things like one-way attack, both like on the air and at sea, not just drones that fly around, but undersea, surface vessels, et cetera, that can be really, implement the same sort of principles and be really effective.
Lauren, I want to pull together a couple of the points that we've been making over this discussion. And first, let me say, I love this discussion. I wrote a number of things about drones like 10 years ago and have been somewhat obsessed with following the overall conversation in this for a while. My entry point to the drone conversation, at least in terms of like research and writing, was around the kind of mindsets that it brings about, both in decision makers and the American people, around the nature of warfare, about the assumptions they're making about how force is deployed, how quickly things can be accessed, and so on, and in our ability to get to adversaries quickly and with precision. And so just to pull a couple of questions, like one is, how should we as listeners, but also as decision makers, what are some assumptions that we may be carrying from like that GWAT era drone warfare that maybe have changed and we need to update our priors to some degree based on what we're seeing right now? And then pulling that all the way to there's a lot of changes going on right now in terms of autonomy, AI and autonomy, and the ability of drones to have access to some of those more advanced capabilities. That is probably one of the biggest changes in assumptions and priors that we should be thinking about, but it's not like necessarily the only one. So I would love to kind of pull that from what are we maybe getting wrong because we're thinking in like that GWAT era, or maybe with some of the things that are still consistent? And what are some of the big things that should be shifting our mindset in terms of how we think about these capabilities, particularly with respect to autonomy?
Absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of the question about autonomy, I think, again, the most interesting case where you see this playing out is in Ukraine, because they're really experimenting. They're really thinking about not just, here's a capability, let's use it because it's cheaper, let's use it because it's increasingly autonomous and we have a limitation of people, but they're really thinking about these capabilities from a sense of like, how can you use them most effectively with what we have to enable the commanders in the field, right, to do more, which is really, really fascinating. And so they don't have this, I would say they've moved probably past, at least they've been the first to move past that kind of mindset of the previous iteration of capabilities, and have really thought innovatively about what sort of concepts of employment, concepts of how do you use them effectively in these systems? I think of like early use cases and early instances in the war in the early days back in like 2022 and 2023, when they were using, autonomous systems as distractions and, with 3D generated, systems that turned even commercial off-the-shelf systems into one-way attack systems and weapons. And so they've really thought about the different ways to employ these capabilities. Then I would say that with autonomy, and especially with the increasing difficulty of the electronic warfare spectrum that you see going on with Russia and Ukraine, you see this cat and mouse game, which is also always pressuring them to evolve and to think about how do you make the system less vulnerable to attack, right? And autonomy is one really good answer to that question, right? If you don't have a comms link, if you don't have a communications link between the operator and the system, it's much less vulnerable to attack. And so you have these clear indications and pressures to lean on autonomy, lean on autonomous systems. And I think that's a very helpful way to think about it. I think when we sometimes hear discussions about autonomous systems, we get a little scared. We get a little bit like there's no human involvement at all, but it's really to protect that kind of human factor and to make things really safe. And it's often a very limited kind of use case and very narrow window of where you want to use this capability for a very specific reason. And so I think the nature of the benefits of these capabilities will hopefully, lead us to evolve our thinking a little bit. But I do think we need to like move our brains a little bit more to the right and think about, this isn't like a plane that has an autonomous system in it that's just going and doing whatever it likes willy-nilly, right? It's often, the human responsibility is always over the use of force. A human has decided to employ a system in a certain context, and that autonomy really helps it achieve a certain capability in a safer and more effective way, in theory.
It's so interesting. Just like so many different distinctions between how our prior assumptions around utilization of drones, particularly in kinetic strikes, very, very different than what the things you're talking about now, particularly when it comes to delegation as against prior conversations being very much in like a situation room context of like, these are the senior most decision makers that are like deciding whether or not we should be utilizing drones in different contexts, and this being delegated significantly further down for any number of the reasons that you just discussed there. And also like your point on autonomy in terms of like shifting your mindset around like the point of autonomy in this particular context is fascinating. I have one big question to close on your new paper. But before I jump onto that, Radha, any other points you want to follow up on from before in terms of like where the United States actually is in terms of our investment here?
Yeah, I think the only other point, Lauren, that just might be worth touching on is we had this executive order unleashing American drone dominance. You mentioned the $1.5 trillion budget, or 1 trillion plus the extra 500, however you want to do the math there. So kind of where, with the benefits of now being a couple months past all of that, an actual war where we can see what the systems are need, do you think there's a gap between intent and what the acquisition system is trying to do? Or you think we just need to push out and execute, or, kind of help us just paint the picture on where the policy and acquisition system is?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's been a lot of intent, obviously, from senior leadership to speed up the acquisitions process, to invest more in everything, and to push, especially with Gen AI, artificial intelligence, autonomy, drones, et cetera, et cetera. So there's been this real effort and a lot of lip service to developing these capabilities. Now, whether that is underlyingly shifted the way that the Pentagon adopts capabilities, which is still quite slow and is not necessarily perfect, as we should say. I don't know if I've seen quite enough momentum on there to truly achieve precise mass, at least from that term, right? To have these systems at scale where you can employ them beyond a single intervention or beyond a few times, right? For the example, like I say, like Lucas was the first time that it was used. The first time that it was used, it was adopted pretty quickly since like last summer. And then you saw it for the first time on the battlefield this past February in Iran. But we don't know how many were used, how effective it was. We don't know what lessons were learned such that the Pentagon will take those lessons and say, we actually want to scale this in a real and meaningful way, and systems like this, especially when we're talking about drones, right? Again, when they say we're unleashing drone dominance, that means everything from first-person view FPV drones that you can get off the shelf to maybe Predator and Reapers. So it really depends on the systems that they're purchasing and at the cutting edge. And again, I haven't seen yet clear indications that they're thinking about this meaningfully from a really structural perspective, other than throwing money at the problem. And so while that's necessary, again, these systems are very low cost. So it's not necessarily that we can't afford them. It's more so that we don't have necessarily the right structures in place to initiate those developers and those maybe non-traditional defense contractors that would be producing these or could produce these for us.
So the last question, I want to build on what you're talking about here in terms of how the Pentagon is investing now. In your new paper, you argue that we keep falling into a time frame fallacy. I love this. Judging a capability on a single moment instead of across its life cycle. And this is like, when I read this, I was like, oh my gosh, I can think of 30 times when we have done this. It's such a great point. So if we apply that lens to Iran, for example, do you have some thoughts on like what we might be getting wrong right now in the heat of war that might look obvious, well, hopefully would look obvious to us in a few years?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. Oh, I love that. Yeah, we have this pull to like think that the technology we're looking at now is like the end all be all, when we know that that's not the case, right? We should think about it more holistically from a lifestyle perspective. Some folks have been using the term, like cradle to grave when it comes to AI, that sort of thing. Like, how do you think about this capability, about where it is today and where it might evolve? I would say that right now you're seeing, again, the first use cases. So I haven't really seen that we're necessarily getting things wrong because everyone's still exploring. It's very clear that they're still exploring. Right now, the limited kind of use case, again, has been using these systems in waves, to strike targets, to hit targets, to destroy targets. And so I'm curious to see where that thinking might evolve and where in future conflicts we might see them used in more creative instances. We might see them, people call them swarms, for example, but I would say they're not really swarms. They're just big masses that they send out. They're not coordinating with each other. These systems aren't clever enough to do that. And so I'm curious if the next evolution will have swarms really actually meaning, swarms that can coordinate an attack in a more efficient way, so to speak. Right now, I can solve this problem by throwing 1 after 2 after 3 after 4 systems at it and eventually destroying it. But what does it actually mean if you can have systems that can interact with one another and decide, or not decide, but realize that a target has not been struck or it has been struck, and so it can go and seek out another target. And so I think the next probably evolution of some of these capabilities is, that's not the only one, but I think of things like that when we see these use cases. It's really kind of a dumb use at the moment, which is what it's useful for. But I'm curious to see, again, how militaries start to scale this, both in terms of, continue to use this for this dumb reason, but also with increasing reliance on capabilities and technologies, how it gets a little bit cleverer in their application and creates more, cost advantages for this precision.
I've learned so much in this conversation, and even better, Rada, we haven't gotten confused by having 2 Laurens on at the same time, except at the very beginning. So win all around. Lauren, it's been such a delight to have you on here. I definitely recommend to listeners to check out her work and publications, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much for having me. It was an absolute hoot.
All right, so for this week for Gong Show, we are revisiting. So spring in the Washington, D.C. area has been ephemeral. I think that is probably the best way to say it. Has been in and out. It was cold this morning. There was a freeze warning over the weekend. So we were trying to remind ourselves of the things we actually enjoy about spring, but also maybe sometimes don't enjoy about spring. But the challenge is alliteration. Rada, you had one earlier that was pretty good in terms of what you enjoy or don't enjoy about spring in terms of alliteration. Do you remember what it was?
Joe, I was just thinking, azaleas was one of them.
Yeah. Allergies?
Oh, allergies and azaleas. That was it.
Yep.
And it was on the one hand, everything is blooming and it's so beautiful and you can go to the arboretum and see the azaleas. And then on the other hand, I go to sit on my porch and it's covered in pollen and my allergies are so unpleasant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to do this in real time. I didn't actually think this through. Okay, sneezing, soft breezes, and shorts. I got to reset my wardrobe finally and got to get out all the other shorts. And I was just very excited to be able to have sundresses and things like that out. I've started doing the gardening transition, but it just hasn't been warm enough. It's not really fun to garden when it's 58 degrees.
I know. Meanwhile, our irises, after many years of cultivation, are really coming out. So I feel like I just don't have another I word to go with irises for spring.
Let's see. Irises.
And also, is it assonance when it's vowels? I think it might be.
Oh, maybe. Oh my gosh. Wow. That came out of nowhere. Something like Independence Day is coming. That's not quite
Independence and irises.
Eyes. IRS, because taxes. We all just paid our taxes. And that's a tough one.
I feel like this is the sort of thing where if you were the sort of person who was watching and then reviewing us, you could comment.
That'd be great in real time. We would have little comment bubbles to the side, little hearts and emojis and things like that. I love wordplay and I'm often very good at emojis, but because of allergies, my brain is just not functioning very well right now.
Yes, so. I feel that.
All right. Well, as I said at the beginning, if you listen to us and love us, leave a review, a real one, not just your stars. Pretty please. Tell a friend and hit the subscribe button, and we'll see you next time.